record on this computer. Okay. Hello. All right. So I am here with Jen Buckley and Joyce Tsai, who just directed the Obermann Humanities Symposium, What Can the Museum Become? And so we're going to reflect a little on that event and then go into a little bit about what's happening right now. So in preparing for this conversation, we talked a little about some of the highlights, and it's impossible not to see the highlights of that symposium through the current lens of what's happening. So you were reflecting particularly on that opening session. If one of you wants to jump in and comment on that.
Sure. I mean, I think it was really quite remarkable that we were able to pull together a symposium that drew from speakers from all over the country, but also allowed us to debut some new spaces and new networks that have really emerged and have grown here in Iowa City. So the first panel took place at the new film scene at the Chauncey, this beautiful space, and it featured really remarkable speakers, including Latanya Otri and Lisa Yun Lee, Kelmia Strong, John Engelbrecht, Anais Duplan, each of whom have had, profound relationships to institutions that have drawn strength from their communities. These are all nonprofits that, operate to try to find new voices, find new ways of doing things, and find new networks. And to have that conversation take place at the Chauncey, at Film Scene, in this amazing new space during a weekend where PS1 and Center for Afrofuturist Studies had an amazing opening of a show that was curated by Jamili Hinson. That came together really beautifully and in ways that were really unanticipated.
So for me, one of the things that was so impactful about that panel, that opening roundtable at the film scene at the Chauncey site, was that it was a very material demonstration of the local arts economy that you're describing, Joyce, which was created, as you said before, and I'm just going to use your phrase, I'm going to cite you here, footnote Joyce, through, sheer sweat equity of arts professionals and community members in our community, Iowa City community, sometimes in collaboration with, and sometimes not in collaboration with, the university arts institutions and the university as an institution more broadly speaking. For me, one of the things that was most, one of the things that's continuing to resonate about that conversation is the points of agreement and also the points of convergence, the divergence among our speakers. They did not always agree with one another. They did not agree with one another about who their institutions were for, who their institutions should be serving, and who institutions like ours can and do serve. And I think the points of divergence were equally valuable to the points of convergence in that conversation. And I'm really glad that there was a demonstration in the room of how sort of large state-funded institutions like ours can coexist in sometimes very comfortable and sometimes, I think, necessarily uncomfortable ways with community-based arts institutions.
I think it also spoke to the different scales at which people work. It spoke to the different voices that we take. It also allowed us to kind of explore, it's also time scale. An institution like PS1 can be much more, and it's built to be much more responsive to the needs of living artists in the community, and what's happening on the ground in ways that larger institutions can't, not just because of bureaucracy, but because that, different institutions are built differently. And so I think one of the things that was really important that came out of the disagreements, and also the impassioned conversations that unfolded, were the ways in which we actually have to support different kinds of institutions at all times, because they do complement one another, they stand in tension with one another, and their difference allows us to see our projects with a more critical view. And I thought that having that as our opening panel and having those conversations unfold in that brand new, projection room at the Chauncey was really important. And we have to think about these questions with renewed urgency since COVID-19. I mean, the question of how we as a community come together and come up with strategies to support and continue supporting all of these, these nonprofit arts spaces that are so vital to what it is that defines us as Iowa City as a community. I think all of these questions become all the more urgent when we reflect on those conversations from this vantage point.
Yeah. And as I was asking you about highlights of the symposium, I loved it that one of the very first things that you said was the reception at Bird Hall. I mean, speaking of a true Iowa City space,
Yeah.
A beloved space. Yeah.
We were so fortunate in preparing for this symposium to be able to speak with Joan Kerr and a series of guests on the World Canvas podcast. And in that podcast, we were able to join forces with Liz Crooks, director of the Pentecrest Museums, and with other museum professionals in Iowa City. And so being in a Pentecrest museum space for the reception in Bird Hall, having been reminded just a couple weeks before by Liz of the very important, not just sort of community functions, but also research functions that the Natural History Museum continues to serve. Having just listened to Johanna Burton's opening keynote lecture in another of the Pentecrest museums, the old Capitol Senate chambers, I think really tied together for us in really sort of felt ways, the ways in which institutions like the Pentecrest museums, which were in some ways bracketed in some of the conversations, mostly arts focused that we were having over the course of this symposium, the important role those institutions play within the broader institution that is the university, but also in the symposium. I mean, these are very, very special sites, and the ways in which those sites inflected the gatherings, the conversations that happened at the reception in Bird Hall, I think was wonderful. And I continue to, as you can see, I continue to smile. I continue to feel the impact of those conversations in those spaces.
Yeah, and that it was also really great that the symposium supports an opportunity for the speakers and the participants of the symposium to come and speak in a very kind of informal context, with members of the general public, with students and faculty. I know that reception was much beloved. And again, like thinking about that reception in light of everything that's happened since, one thing that I wonder about are how we, going forward, sustain forms of conviviality and conversation and fellowship that being in Bird Hall, sort of fostered so naturally.
Mm-hmm.
What will these spaces look like in the future? And I'm not saying that receptions will disappear, but I think that it's just a kind of question about. It made me realize how important receptions are to me. Because it's in those kind of like informal, everybody's had an opportunity to reflect on, some really complex ideas, Johanna Burton really hit on the necessity of building institutions while being anti-establishment. You know, how do we, like, having conversations about that idea with the audience in this in Byrd Hall, that has been which is in a a natural history museum that has been painstakingly built up for over the course of a century. It takes on different inflections that you can't really capture in a kind of more neutral environment.
Yeah.
And the reception also reminds us of, an aspect of museums that was highlighted over and over again across the round tables and in the keynote lectures. Museums are social spaces.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
They're social spaces. They are not necessarily, and even when they are sort of white-walled institutions where people go to contemplate high art, even those spaces are social spaces. They're spaces where we consume art, culture. And one of the aspects of that opening roundtable that sort of continued, that theme was that museums have not just responsibilities to, paying visitors, those visitors which have gone away for all museums right now during the course of the pandemic, but museums have responsibilities to publics. And one of the things that to me stands out with, I think, renewed force under pandemic conditions is that museums are now asking themselves in very urgent ways. I mean, certainly many kinds of institutions have been doing this for a long time, and that's why it was a part of the conversations. All museums are starting to have to ask themselves in a sense of renewed urgency, who is our public? How do we reach them? Under what conditions can we serve them? And I think there should be shifts in emphasis, even for institutions that have been asking those questions, I think in really publicly beneficial ways for a long time.
Yeah, I was just saying to my daughter this weekend, and I was having I imagine most of us are having little whiny pandemic moments of like, and I was saying, I just want to go to Chicago and go to the, go to museums and walk down Michigan Avenue. And it is, that social aspect of it, is really dear and easy to forget.
And I think it was also great that when we think about symposia, we don't necessarily think about it being in the presence of artworks or artifacts or objects. And I think we worked hard with our partners across campus to make these opportunities possible. Special collections brought out these amazing objects from the new Sackner collection, from the Dada collection, Atka collection. We had an opportunity at the Stanley Museum of Art to, get people to think about deep ways of diving in deep into, object-based learning experiences across disciplines. And we had the experience at the Pentacrest museums. And, I think what was great about the symposium was that we had these wonderful conversations, but we also had, it was also punctuated by these shared experiences that also included the debut of Heidi Warren Bartlett's Downriver, again at the Chauncey at Film Scene. And so we had lots of spaces where we did have that kind of social experience activated, which I thought was really quite lovely.
Joyce, just to follow up on your point about Heidi Warren Bartlett's film Downriver, for those who weren't able to see it but who are watching this video, the film documents a piece of performance art that was created in part on site at the Old Art Museum. And for me, one of the most moving aspects of our symposium was that it gave us the opportunity to publicly and collectively mourn again the loss of the old art museum, and also to celebrate the building as we were speaking of the new building for the art museum. And so that conversation that followed that film, and sort of the private conversations that happened after we left the room, really did offer a time and a space for us inside a gorgeous new Iowa City Arts Institution to mourn, and also to dream of the future. And that is an element of the symposium I had, even though I knew what Downriver was, I hadn't been expecting that.
Yeah, and also, you know, being able to kind of march people across campus. You know, we went from film scene, another site was at ABW. So that gave people an opportunity to look at West Campus, and, you know, the kind of physically roaming one space to the next, from the Pentacrest to the IMU, also allowed us to kind of physically unlock, you know, the history of the arts in Iowa City and at the university, as well as the history of the kind of physical changes, ecological changes that we've experienced over the years. So, you know, it was also a really great way for us to build the excitement for the new building that, you know, we're still planning to open in 2022, and construction is, you know, we got that second floor already in. So it's very exciting.
And for many of our guests, you know, to whom we were explaining this history, this was a revelation.
Yeah.
One of the things I loved about the symposium was that we got to educate our guests about the very long, actually uncommonly long history of contemporary arts, a cutting edge contemporary arts practice on this campus, and to tie the conversations we were having about the future of the museum to the incredibly innovative past of the arts on this campus was, again, another, I mean, I had expected it to occur, but the degree to which it occurred was another sort of unexpected, very pleasant outcome of the symposium gathering.
Absolutely. And, you know, our like being able to talk about things like the, you know, intermedia MFA program, about the data collection, you know, bringing Amelia Jones to special collections, and having Tim Scheib and Pete Balestri show her these objects that she was just like, you know, these 60s performance documentation. I mean, it was just really quite stunning. The depth and the breadth of the material that we have at our disposal and at our fingertips. I mean, it was, you know, I went through that process myself when I came here for the first time in 2016. And yeah, it's an amazing collection.
So to circle around now to kind of just some ending thoughts in terms of where and this isn't really fair to be your ending thoughts, because as I said earlier, I think the two of you could speak very well on this for an hour, but if you could just help some of us who are not so immersed in the world of museums to understand what's happening right now in the museum world in the face of this pandemic. What are you seeing and hearing?
I think there are a lot of ways that museums are responding to try to reach their audiences online and think very creatively about what their mission is. So we have institutions that are collecting institutions and finding ways of, you know, activating these digital surrogates, you know, these objects online by getting their audiences to, some of it's fun and goofy and ways of connecting as communities around these objects, kind of rallying around these institutions in digital formats. And then we have non-collecting institutions doing things like, you know, virtual tours, broadcasts of recordings. You know, I think there's so much, there's a vitality online that's really quite inspiring. I mean, the flip side is that institutions that that rely on admissions as part of their revenue model. You know, we're seeing a lot of institutions laying off temporary workers, terminating contracts, But you also have a lot of nonprofits whose futures are in jeopardy. So there's a kind of simultaneity of ingenuity and innovation that's going on in all sorts of unanticipated ways. But there are also a lot of headwinds that nonprofits and museums are facing, just like most other industries.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hoping to see is that this crisis encourages institutions that had not been thinking in expansive and equity forwarding ways about who their publics are, what their mission is, and what it might mean to provide diverse communities access to art and art making practices. My hope is that this crisis will force all institutions to do that kind of thinking, that some of the institutions, indeed representatives of those institutions who are at the symposium, have been able to do. My fear is that some of the large scale layoffs and furloughs that we're seeing that Joyce has just alluded to, my fear is that those will be more or less permanent, that this will serve in arts institutions, museums of all kinds, and indeed in education as an opportunity to further scale back investment of all kinds, especially public investment in our institutions. And so I prefer at this moment, as always, to continue to hope, but while keeping in view very clearly the fears that are shared very, very broadly across the museum sector right now.
I think, we're also at a moment where certain kinds of institutions are going to have opportunities that are unexpected. I mean, like the Stanley Museum, I'm just speaking of specifically, I mean, we're in this moment of transition where our building isn't open yet. And, there are going to be impacts that this this moment of crisis is going to have on us. But we have continued to pay our interns. We have continued to pay our fellows. We have, continued to maintain our staff. That's something that's really important to us. But we're able to do this in part because we are not reliant on, ticket fees. We don't charge admission. And we have a different kind of overhead structure. So, I think there are certain institutions that are going to be able to weather this in different ways. I'm not going to say better. It's just going to be different. But it does allow us to articulate more fully why we're committed to supporting interns and fellows, and the importance of the educational staff, the importance of the preparatory staff. It allows us to articulate these values in no uncertain terms, not only so that we can secure our resources for the present, but also to grow them in the future. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for an institution to have to do. It's just to have to do it under these circumstances is extremely difficult. But we have already, started seeing some really innovative responses and solutions to these questions. And a lot of institutions are, instead of laying staff off, converting them into staff that do the work of digitization, So we're taking this opportunity to kind of face inward for a while so that they can maximize public access in the future. So, it's we're in a moment of undoubted crisis, but we also might find ourselves in a kind of chrysalis stage where every institution has to, reformulate what they look like, how they operate, and how they understand their publics and how they reach, and how they achieve this kind of renewed mission. So, I mean, that can be really exciting, but also really terrifying.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to work on this symposium.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I'm so glad that it happened right in the nick of time.
Right in the nick of time.
Yeah. All right.